I have a choice, and it's really close. 51% stay, 49% go. And it simply arises in this way that says something like, I think there's some things I need to do here before I go. I haven't done them. Hi, everybody. My name's Jonathan Van Balen. These days, I spend most of my time being a spiritual teacher and sometimes a healer. But long before that became my number one way of being in the world, there were some pivotal moments along the way, including an NDE that I would share with you today. And that took place at the age of 29 years old for me. I had just come through a surgery. I was in the hospital for 4 days. The details of it not particularly important. This was not an operating table kind of near-death experience. I was released after 4 days into the care of my father, who was simply going to watch over me. There wasn't much that he could do. This was a surgery for a sleep apnea issue, and I mention it only because it's a surgery that's rarely done. One of the reasons it's rarely done is because the recovery from it is known for being exceptionally painful. There are other reasons as well, but it's a kind of a nightmare to recover from. And that was a big part of this NDE in the sense that 3 or 4 days into my father's care, I experienced inwardly what I would describe as an inner click. It was as clear as any experience I've ever had. And in that instance of that click, I knew very clearly, see and feel, and was experiencing quite directly that the animating life force in me was simply beginning to drain away. My body was beginning to shut down, it was beginning to die. And there were three recognitions that flooded in. That they came in quite simultaneously. There's no way for me to pick them apart at all, but I have to sort of tell it sequentially. And so the first of those recognitions in the moment of that click was that I was not my body, that there was an aware consciousness, an aspect of my being that was very aware and very alive. It's recognizing that that body was dying. But it was very clear that that aware consciousness, that aware sense of being itself, was not only not contained within that body, not limited by that body, but it had never been contained by that body. And there was sort of an automatic and immediate kind of freedom in that. But one of the biggest parts of that freedom in that particular moment for me at that time was simply that if I wasn't my body, and I knew that unequivocally in that moment, what it also meant was that I was not the pain that was in that body. And so what had been absolutely mind-bending, black-house levels of pain for days was something that I was completely free of, in the sense of I was free of the suffering of it. I would clarify, the pain in that body didn't actually change. It was as present as ever. But I needed not suffer from it. It was the first time, and by no means was it the last, that I discovered a remarkable and clear difference between pain and suffering. And in this case, there was complete freedom from that suffering. And as a result, a complete freedom as well, overall. The body had the appearance in that moment of having had an illusory quality to itself. That's how that aware beingness could look upon it and recognize that it wasn't the body. That some would say that was an out-of-body experience. In a way it was, but in the way that most people describe that, this was a little bit different, and I would be kind of subtle about it in saying it's not as though I was over here and the body was over there, and those were two very clearly different things, and both of them very present and very real. One was recognizing the other. It was that aware beingness recognized that the body had a fundamentally illusory quality to it. So even if my awareness or consciousness seemed like it hadn't changed places, it still was very clearly aware that I wasn't my body. Uh, and and that not only was that body illusory, but everything in this dimension that contained the body had essentially an illusory quality also. And if it was in fact illusory, something illusory isn't actually real. It doesn't have fundamentally real being. And so there was never a body there in the first place, really, to have contained me in the first place. That aware being recognized that it had never been limited by, never been fully contained by that body. which is, I mentioned it only because it's a little bit of a different take on how people often describe what they might call out-of-body experiences. And again, in this case, it conferred a sense of freedom that was absolutely overwhelming in that moment. The second realization that came was simply that the life force in this body was draining away relatively slowly. It was going to take at least a few days. And that's exactly how it went, in fact. But I mention it here and now simply because it was part of why there was no sense of urgency. One of the things that was very surprising in the moment of that click and recognizing that this body was beginning to die was that in that freedom of recognizing I wasn't body, and in that moment of recognizing that there was some time, there was a way in which I could revel in that experience and just sit with it and know that it was going to be a little while, and I could just soak in it and marinate. And there was no sense of urgency in it in any way, which is particularly supported by the sort of third recognition or revelation that flooded in at the same time as well. And it's one that is even a bit more subtle and frequently a little hard to put into words. But if in that first recognition I would describe myself as an aware being separate from the body, it was still a separated sense of self. There was a sense of identity, an individuated identity that simply knew it wasn't contained or limited by that body. But in this third recognition, there was the experience of that non-corporeal yet individuated sense of being beginning to itself dissolve, to fade away, and to dissolve into the absolutely overwhelming allness, the vastness. It's where words begin to fail. But that sense of an individuated yet non-corporeal self just began to fade into the all-encompassing wholeness. And in that was a kind of freedom that even those other recognitions couldn't even come close to encompassing. What I would hasten to share in that is that in fading into that, dissolving into that allness, well, if it's all, then it contains everything. And in that sense, it couldn't possibly be missing anything. And it's in that way that I could begin to wrap words around the experience that even though I was disappearing into it in a sense, there could not possibly be a sense of loss in it. There could not possibly be a sense of loss or lack or want or need, because what is absolutely all-encompassingly all literally contains everything. And it was like becoming that. So not only could there be no sense of lack or want, need in any way whatsoever, if those things are essentially impossible, then it's essentially impossible for there to be a sense of fear. And so it was like being enveloped in what's known in a popular source, the peace that passes all understanding. And even though that body was racked with mind-bending levels of pain, and it was in fact dying, even that couldn't trigger any response in any way that there was something wrong, bad, or that needed fixing or changing in any way. Even though that body was beginning to die, again, there was no sense of lack or want or need in any way at all. And so, curiously, there was no sense of urgency. There was no sense of, in any way, something needed to change or be done about the situation. And it's also about this time that my father, who has been watching over me for the last few days, comes into the room. There's really not much that he could be doing other than, I'm staring out a window. Have I tipped over or not? There's just not much for him to do. This is out at the family farmhouse. He's sort of coming in and out doing chores and house chores and farm chores and things. And he kind of takes a look at me. And even though I'm well aware that my body is dying, my impulse to communicate that is absolutely zero. All I can the only thing that makes any sense to me at all is simply to look at him come into the room, to smile at him, and feel loving towards him. And that's all. And that's exactly what I do. Many people, many of us, probably every single person listening to this has surely heard the phrase in some way or another that love is the opposite of fear, or fear is the opposite of love. And if what I've just described was a state of mind in which fear was literally not just absent, but essentially impossible, then it makes sense that the sort of natural default setting then is simply something overwhelmingly peaceful and essentially loving. And again, that's peaceful even in the face of that pain and the fact that the body is in fact dying. That peace still could not be disturbed by that seeming circumstance. And that is simply how I spent the rest of the day. And that's how I spent the time as the night came and I fell asleep, which had been very difficult for the past many days. And I would check in during the night when I woke up. Am I still dying? Yes, yes, I am. That life force is draining away faster and faster as well. My body is beginning to slow down. The time is getting a little shorter. I still don't know when it's going to be finally complete, but it's still, in as far as I can tell, and it's a guess in my mind at that time, it's still probably a day and a half or something like that. And so I wake into the next day in the same state of mind, still the same experience. It is essentially an experience of overwhelming peace, great love, and profoundly intense silence. And there's also a thought that arises that following day of recognizing that at the rate the life force is leaving, I will get to the end, well, a bit sooner. And what appears is simply that I actually do have a choice in the matter, and I can choose to go through that doorway or over that threshold, but I also have a choice not to do that. And that choice presents itself in a way that is completely and totally without an effort. There's no such thing as merit involved with it or something like that. It's merely a choice to go through that doorway. Is as easy as falling off a log. It's also uh, it became, in retrospect, more it became an interesting question, like why wouldn't one go through that door? This is talking about heading into the fullness of the greatest peace that one could possibly imagine. Why wouldn't that seem like a good idea? All encompassing love, all encompassing wholeness. How could that not seem like a good idea? It really kind of does. And especially when I compare it to coming back to this dimension where things are frequently absolutely chaotic, it became an interesting question. And I do not know why then, and in a way I don't still, why then the thought would arise that I think I'm not going to go through that doorway. I think I'm going to stay here. I have a choice, and it's really close. 51% stay, 49% go. And it simply arises in this way that says something like, I think there's some things I need to do here before I go. I haven't done them. I think I'll stay. And at that time, when that thought arose, it was baffling to me because I thought, I have no idea what those things are. I have no idea. I just feel like there's something undone that I am to do. And I'm inclined to stick around, figure it out, and do them. And so that's just kind of how I land on that choice. And it doesn't really surprise me that once again, soon after that choice has been made, that thought has gone through my head, my father comes into the room once again. This is well into the second day of this, and this time the look on his face changes and he squinches his eyes up at me. He says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we're going to load up the car and we're going to head back over to the hospital, which is exactly what we do. I'm very slow. I take forever. I'm not in a hurry. The fact that I'm still dying has become sort of comically irrelevant to me. The body itself just doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. It's not that important in a way. And it's a 2-hour drive. It's not short. we go back to the hospital that this surgery was conducted at in the first place. We go to the emergency room in this case, and the emergency room doctors quickly discover I am in fact dying. This is the first moment that my father realizes that I was beginning to die. And I'm dying for the absolutely dumbest reason in medical science, pretty much. I'm dying because of dehydration. That's why my body is shutting down. And without getting into comments on what healthcare is like and all about, this was a case in which, having been in the hospital for 4 days and removed from the hospital in a state in which I could essentially not really functional eat or drink. And so you get enough days of that in a row, and by the time I'm back there in the ER, it's been about a week, and I've lost probably 12 pounds, and I'm dying from dehydration. But it also means it's an extremely simple fix. So they poke an IV in my arm. And is the instant that they do that, all of these processes reverse. That feeling of merging into the infinite and into the vastness immediately begins to reverse. I can feel the life force literally flowing in, and I am coming back and putting my feet metaphorically back on the ground. And because of that choice that had been made earlier that day, that thought that had arisen, that, leaving that perfect peace and leaving that infinite space was met with a kind of also quiet joy. I'm going to come back here. That's the choice. That's good. That's good. All right. I'll do it. I'll come back here. And on the car ride back, I find myself reflecting a great deal on all of these things. I also find that at no point during any of this experience was I capable of expressing myself. There's no way I could possibly look in my father's eyes and said, I'm dying, but also that's perfectly fine. There's no way I could possibly have explained to him that I wasn't my body, or that I had the words to articulate that this body had this illusory quality to it, and that merging into the infinite vastness was an experience that was so far beyond anything I'd encountered as a human here. It just simply seemed inexpressible. But also, the only way that I could even begin to approach it would be like by using a word like love. And as a 29-year-old young man, I wasn't even particularly good at that. But I knew that I couldn't unsee what I'd seen or unexperience what I had experienced. I also knew that I was going to have a difficult time reacclimating. 3 weeks after all of this, I was healed up enough. I went back to my place. I went back to my job, and had the experience of being late for work, eating a breakfast burrito, racing through traffic, getting to my job, and thinking I cannot reconcile this experience with my regular daily grind. I can't figure out where to put it or how to reconcile it. And it took many, many other years and many other additional spiritual experiences to put those pieces back together in a way that became full and rich and ended up feeling really, truly embodied. There were so many other experiences that come my way first. Many of them had to do with death and dying. One of them included the fact that I ended up with my father as he lay dying, and got to meet with him on a sort of inner level and go with him. If this is the kind of language that one was familiar with, it was like meeting on a spirit level, meeting on a soul level with him, and traveling with him, even though his actual physical body was completely unconscious at this particular moment, and going out to the very edge of that same all-encompassing vastness so that I could sort of bring him there and share that experience with him. And I knew in that moment that it was one of the most beautiful experiences I'd ever had with my father. It felt like a joy. It felt like an honor. And I knew that I would not have been able to walk with him to that place if I didn't already know it from my prior experience. If I knew where we were going. And so it was one of the experiences that showed me how that even though I had encountered some tremendous suffering in finding this place myself some years before, that suffering had turned out to be absolutely irrelevant. It was utterly forgotten. And um, the opportunity to share that with him in the way that I did felt like the greatest honor and the greatest way of sharing some kind of love, which was very helpful because a few hours later, I was tasked personally with telling the doctors when to unhook the machines and let my father die. And so, again, when that moment came, I knew that I was probably the only person in the room that knew essentially where he was going to be going. I had spent the last few hours with him this way. And so, even though that's one of those kinds of tasks that sounds terrible, it was possible to meet it with a sense of not only being greatly honored by being the person chosen for this task, but a tremendous amount of peace in this way of helping escort him into his own next phase of experience. And it's experiences like that. There've been so many others that came my way that had a lot to do with suffering, and the the most central aspect of that near-death experience and what became eventually kind of a focus of my own inner journey was the fact that in that near-death experience, it was one of the occasions in which I had the sort of overall experience of directly meeting this fact that the the sense of an individuated sense of self that I carried around with me all the time, it seemed, for the most part, was was itself sort of a perspective and point of view and an experience that was built on all kinds of thoughts and ideas that at their core didn't really have truth to them. And so over the following decade, I began to look inward more and more and more in a way that for me was extremely private. I was never part of a group I wasn't seeking teachers or something like that. That was just not, it just wasn't my way. And I don't know how to explain that other than it was just an extremely inner journey in my case. But I would turn inward and I began to actively sort of look like, well, where is that sense of self? Where does it reside? Where does it fit? Where is it sitting? And I would poke around and look for it. It's as though I, over and over and over and over, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And there also came sort of these corollary experiences where, in fact, there was a time which we don't have time to go into the details, but in a particular case where I ended up sitting quietly uh, and felt as though the collective, this is a crazy thing to say out loud, the collective suffering, I went from sort of experiencing my own suffering from my own past and had that morph into the experience of experiencing the collective suffering of mankind, in the sense that it felt as though all 8 billion souls were experienced as their fundamental oneness. And out of that was experienced that fundamental suffering of all 8 billion, which was an experience of a wild overwhelm. I cannot even begin to come close to putting into words. But it became a part of this decade that followed that NDE that pushed me ever closer to reconciling with how all of these experiences fit together, and which sort of culminated ultimately in a series of experiences in which that fundamental sense of a lack of an individuated sense of self just sort of settled in a way that seemed to be permanent. And I can say that it has never left since that moment. And it comes with the kind of peace that I've pointed to throughout all of this. And there's a way in which that turned my life completely upside down. And so that there came a point where I actually had to leave my former life completely. I did so in a way that sounds, well, the sort of thing you read about in spiritual stories sometimes. And I sold my business to my partner, and I sold my car, and I said goodbye to the lovely woman I had been with. And I gave the keys to my home to someone I barely knew. And I disappeared for months and months. And it was during those months that this sort of final reconciliation sort of took root. And when I came back from that, I knew that I would never return fully to my old life. And I never have. It's also a period of time in which, to my absolute shock, appeared some healing gifts and some intuitive gifts that I wouldn't have expected. I didn't expect, and that took quite some time for me to feel as though I could kind of get used to. But those are all things that have become a part of present, in a way that when it's possible to share these things with people, it's really what it comes down to is all of those experiences and those gifts, if we have to call them that, being pathways through which it becomes possible to simply meet with people and share that fundamental oneness and have that kind of experience rise up in them, at least in some way that they find accessible or acceptable or understandable. And that can take many, many, many forms. But that's kind of where it all leads in the end. And if I had to sum it up by saying, what was it that I needed to be here on the planet for? Why would I bother to have stuck around? It's hard to imagine anything other than that being much of a reason. But it seems to be about the best reason I can come up with. And so that's why it's delightful to be here with you today. I welcome absolutely anyone to reach out to me. So far, I have a perfect track record of reaching back. See if I can keep that up. But there is, of course, a website, and I can be found at assistthespirit.com. And anyone's welcome there to find some articles. Some of these stories are written down in videos, and there's also a way to write me an email. There's also a way to even book me for some private time. It's a thing people do from time to time, and I welcome that as also. I also travel around a lot and speak to people tends to be wherever I'm invited. So I'm always willing and try to make myself as available for that as possible. And it's a joy. So come on over. The water's nice. And wherever you are on the spiritual journey at all, you are welcome to this table.